Dead Rising 3 was revealed on June 10, 2013. Once again announced to be an exclusive launch title for a Microsoft console. This time actually fulfilling that promise as it released alongside the Xbox One later that year. With that came a lot of big changes compared to the previous game. Now, Keiji Inafune had jack shit to do with the series whatsoever. Blue Castle became Capcom Vancouver as they were set to have complete control over the series, and the scale of the game itself continued to get even larger. For the final time, let's take things from the top. About a decade after Chuck Green's mishaps in Fortune City, yet another outbreak happens in the town of Los Perdidos, California. The game takes place 3 days after everything's already gone to shit. Things have gone so badly, in fact, that the military plan to level the entire city within a week. You assume the role of yet another new hero, Nick Ramos, a skilled mechanic. After Nick finds out about the planned firebombing, he and his friends, Rhonda, Dick, and Annie, must try to find a way to escape the infested city, or die trying. First, let's talk about what's new. So, let's start with the time limit. As stated, the time limit provided is a whole week this time around. Apparently, people thought that 72 hours was just too constrictive. So, in response, the developers finally listened and bumped it up to 168 hours. Just to make sure. Because of this, the day and night cycle is also slowed down a little. Side objectives have a time limit like before, but story missions no longer have time limits. They can now be completed at your own pace, making the game easier to 100%, or to run through it like a maniac, if you're into that sort of thing. You can also save anywhere, anytime now through the pause menu. You can still save in bathrooms or porta potties, but there's no real reason to use them now, is there? Unless you enable Nightmare Mode. Nightmare Mode is a different difficulty setting available from the start that forces you to use the bathrooms to save and also gives you 72 hours to complete the game for a more classic experience. I have my own issues with Nightmare Mode, but we'll get into it later. The world this time is much larger. Los Perdidos was made to completely dwarf Willamette and Fortune City's maps combined. And believe it or not, it did just that. You have a giant city with 4 different districts to explore, all with tons of buildings, houses, and areas to go into and scavenge. And all of it is rendered in real time with no loading screens in between. Pretty impressive. Each area has different items to find and barely any of the buildings look like, while having a decent amount of detail put into each of them. Sometimes you'll end up hopping from rooftop to find weapons, blueprints, or whatever else might be out there. It's honestly pretty refreshing. I haven't seen this much effort go into an open world like this in quite a bit. In a world where there's a number of sandbox games that sell off of how big their worlds are yet have little to nothing in it, it's good to see that this is at least attempting to break the trend. The game visually also looks pretty good, although most of the time the color palette seems to consist of dark gray and puke brown. The character models and even the whole city is amped with more detail. The city is quite literally overflowing with zombies. They constantly climb out of drains, walk off of buildings, and fall out of windows. It's pretty fucking cool if you ask me. There's also better motion capture work being done, there's a larger amount of variation in the look of the zombies, and the gore effects for the zombies have even more detail. Interestingly enough, this actually carries on into gameplay. Say if you cut a zombie in half, horizontally or vertically, there is a chance that said zombie will still flop around and grab onto your leg to attack you. Which, I gotta admit, I don't think I've seen that done before. Oh, speaking about cutting shit in half, we should probably talk about the weapons now. The number of regular weapons has yet again increased, offering a bunch of new firearms, explosives, and melee weapons. Combo weapons again also make a grand return. If you have a blueprint of a weapon, you can now make them anywhere without the need of a bench. And you can now use similar items to make combo weapons instead of the exact item needed like before. The amount of weapons you can make has also increased from 50 to 100. There's also blueprints to create new super combo weapons. Take a combo weapon and add yet another stupid thing to it and you're done. It's a cool idea, but it only equates to a small number of slightly different variations for 7 types of existing combo weapons, so it's not as greatly realized as it could have been. Some combo weapons make their return, like the Defiler and the Freedom Bear, and you're even able to make Adam's mini chainsaws from Dead Rising 1. But some new combo weapons also make their debut, like the Grim Reaper, the Mauler, and the game's cover weapon, the Sledge Saw. Another addition is a weapons locker. Any combo weapon that you create, pick up off of a boss, or anything that you find and pick up in general in the world, you can find and equip it back in the locker. There's a limit whenever you pick something from the locker, so you can't take everything all at once. You can find these lockers in different safe houses you visit. There are tons of safe houses around the city, and to unlock more, you'll have to clear out all the zombies in each of them. The system returns yet again, but with some well-needed changes. It took them 3 fucking games, but finally, whenever you level up, you can finally pick and choose what attributes and skills you get from a skill tree rather than having said skills be automatically assigned like before. There's also a couple new ways that you can earn points. You can earn points through finding collectibles, challenges called survival training, and another new addition called tragic endings. Combat and movement have also received some changes. Both are a little bit slower than before, as Nick has weight and momentum now compared to Frank and Chuck. So it takes him a bit to start running, takes him a bit to attack, and whenever he holds larger items, it impacts his movement speed. Nick also has a limited range auto-aim blind fire when running and gunning, and can also throw stuff without aiming, which is very useful. Vehicles now have a much larger role within the game. Since Nick is a skilled mechanic, he's able to combine vehicles to make them tougher and deadlier. There's sadly not that many choices, really, but what little choices you have, they're still useful to help navigate around the zombies and still very fun to drive. Such as the Roller Hog, which is my personal favorite for no reason, really. There's been quite a few changes to how survivors work too. Most likely you'll run into survivors surrounded by zombies. You clear out the zombies, they drop off a weapon and promptly fuck off. However, there are also some survivors that you hear about over the radio, much like normal. They offer side quests. If you help them out, they then join you in return. Yep, you heard right. There's no longer any escorting a survivor back to a safe house. I presume the devs wanted to make you feel as if you were getting more out of rescuing people, so now survivors act as interchangeable partners. And I gotta admit, I think I had less trouble out of them here than I ever did in previous entries. For starters, they actually were more aggressive, more willing to take whatever weapon I gave them, and actually managed to keep up with me. So they certainly are more competent. At the same time though, I feel like having them on you makes the game twice as easy as it already kind of is, as they also have much more health this time around alongside their smarts. Where there are survivors, there are psychopaths. I feel like the ones that you fight in the story here are rather forgettable. But there is another optional set of psychos found within the city that are subtly yet not so subtly based on the 7 deadly sins. Here, I feel like we have a slightly better sense of variety compared to the main boss fights. You have your closer range fights, your slightly longer range fights, and even a fight mostly involving vehicles. While a good majority of the fights can be pretty outrageous and stupid, I can give some brownie points for at least trying to be creative. And from what I've noticed, the optional 7 bosses have whatever sin they represent expressed within their attacks or their weaknesses, though the fights never really get too complicated or in-depth. As cool as the concept itself is, part of me still feels like more could have been done with it, you know? Oh shit, is it that time again? Alright, let's talk about the story and characters. Sorry, I'd be more enthusiastic, but I honestly don't know what to say about the story, let alone how to make it sound interesting. As said, the story here revolves around Nick and his friends escaping a firebombing run. Pretty cut and dry for the most part, except what's frustrating here is that the journey isn't much of a journey. It's more so a constant amount of setbacks preventing them to finish the primary objective. That being said, I feel that to properly reiterate how utterly uninteresting this is, I have to explain how the main story is structured. So without further ado, let's get through this as quick as possible. Leaving Rhonda's garage, Nick and Rhonda try to escape the city by using the highway's military checkpoint. By the time they get there, it's taken over by bikers. Said bikers try to kill Nick and rape Rhonda. Boss fight. Nick's friend Diego says that there's an old airplane that can be used to escape the town. Nick gets bit by a zombie just because. Nick then goes to a funeral home to find some zombrex and ends up meeting a mobster with giant fucking hands named Gary. Turns out Nick is immune, but that's not important right now. Gary's looking for someone that his boss wants to find. Turns out his boss wants Annie. If Nick finds Annie, Gary can get him fuel for the plane. Her friend Red also says he can get Nick finds Annie, who's a member of the team if does some military during the boss fight. So Nick's friend Diego says that there's Now, if any of that sounded like a boring chore, that's because it was. Now, don't get me wrong, the gameplay in between was fine, but the story felt like it was one elongated and constantly interrupted fetch quest. Outside of its use of the Carlito missing orphan plotline from Dead Rising 1 and having a little time spent with Chuck in overtime mode, the story is really fucking flat. characters aren't much better. Most of the cast just exists with having very little to be remembered for. I honestly wouldn't know what to say about any of them except maybe Nick. Nick might be a block of wood, but in some weird way, for some reason, he's still at least somewhat likable. In general, there's not much to hate him for outside of just being annoying at times. Nick's just a really important yet forgettable dweeb, and I guess that's enough for me to at least try and root for him. So, final thoughts? In some ways, Dead Rising 3 does things better than 2 did in my opinion. There are more cool yet ridiculous combo weapons, there's some more experimentation with vehicular combat, survivors are smart enough to keep up with you and kill things for once, the world is much larger without sacrificing the detail that we've come to appreciate, and it actually uses a forgotten plotline from Dead Rising 1 and surprisingly expands upon it. Yet, at the same time, the game holds your hand extensively. You can save wherever you want, the time limit gives you way too much time, and overall, the game itself just isn't very difficult. Although Nightmare Mode addresses these issues on top of making psychos and zombies deal more damage and take less of it, it's still easy as fuck. Here's some footage of the first 2 boss fights with and without Nightmare Mode. I'd argue to say that I had more trouble the first time around since I didn't know the patterns. I could be wrong, but to me I noticed very little difference in terms of difficulty. Safe houses are still plentiful and are within close enough proximity to where you're still never really in danger, and guns can be found practically everywhere, that is, if you don't already have them in your weapons locker. Even that being said, it also won't help the really mediocre story either. The most I could say about Dead Rising 3 is, it's a slightly improved yet heavily casualized version of Dead Rising 2, which is already saying something. I give it a couple of points for truly making improvements in the places they did, but I'm afraid I can't look past the lack of challenge this time around, even with Nightmare Mode, which, yes, is available from the get-go. Was the game entertaining? Outside of the story's weak writing and mission structure, yes. Was effort put into it? Though it may not feel like a traditional Dead Rising game at times, I can tell that the developers still cared about this game and still have a bit of love towards the original series in some way. But would I play it again? I honestly don't think I see myself doing so, as much as I hate to say it. There is a good number of things to do and find, and it is a good game, don't misunderstand me, but I personally am just not interested to revisit it. Final thoughts on the series as a whole? Dead Rising is a series that I would absolutely recommend. Over the past 12 years, the series has brought us 3 great action games, and while each entry has their slight, and I do mean slight, ups and downs for various reasons, at the same time I feel like there's nothing too objectively wrong with each game, not to sound inconsistent. They offer great combat, assortments of weapons to use, a generous amount of freedom and variety, some memorable characters, ridiculous moments, and with a world that gets progressively larger with each game, you'll find that there is a fair amount of replayability to be found. As I said in the first video, there was nothing quite like Dead Rising. Its level of freedom, as well as its love for the source material that inspired it, was almost unparalleled. It's a series that over time has earned its reputation and its place in history, and I don't think I could sing its praises any harder than I already have. If you haven't tried the series yet, give it a shot sometime. You might just fall in love with killing zombies all over again.
Gave me blue balls, you tease.